Okay, this is Don Larson again. Well, I think we are ready to get started. So again, welcome to the webinar on 2D and 3D graphics. The housekeeping rules, just quickly, before we get started, all attendees are muted for the duration of the webinar. If you should experience any technical issues, use the little control chat window in the webinar control panel. We have some information, some handouts in the handout sections. These are little PDFs, informational PDFs that you can drag and drop to your desktop. So we invite you to do that. Post questions during the webinar using this panel. And then we'll answer all questions at the end of the main presentation. We'll either do them directly or we'll follow up with a email. For those of you not familiar with Larson Software Technology, we're based in Houston, Texas. We were founded in 1984, and as graphics technology experts, when we've been doing that for over 30 years. In the very beginning of our company, we started promoting CGM usage by the use of a free CGM viewer. We're a member of the CGM Open Foundation. We develop powerful 2D and 3D technical illustration, conversion, and viewing solutions primarily based on open formats. We're a developer of the first HTML CGM viewer that eliminated the need for a plugin to view CGMs in a browser. We were the first to introduce a CGM profile to assist with the standardization of the SVG file format and permit mapping of CGM to SVG and using primarily to use CGM or SVG as an exchange format. We currently participate in the S1000D graphics and multimedia working group. Just a quick overview of our products. On the left-hand column are our technical illustration products. We're working with 2D and 3D data. In the center, we've got a collection of file conversion products to assist with conversion of data, primarily CGM to other formats, also things like converting PDFs and DWGs to CGM. And then on the right-hand column, there's a list of our graphics viewing technology, both standalone and as SDK, so that we have a number of companies that embed our 3D and CGM viewer in their CSDB or in their IEDM products. So that said, I'm going to now turn it over to David Manock for the rest of the presentation. And so,
thank you, Don. Good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, we're going to cover 2D and 3D data today. We'll give you an overview of the main file formats that we believe are used in technical illustration. We're going to focus on open formats today as well. So formats that aren't particularly native formats for, say, CAD systems or illustration systems. So open formats that are supported by the industry, for instance, for example, S1000D. The most common 2D file formats are kind of well established, and probably a lot of you are aware of them and what they do, but we'll go through that today. And then those include both raster and vector formats, which we'll also give a bit of an explanation about as well. In 3D, it's a bit of a different story. There are a multitude of different file formats available, so difficult to support them all. Certainly within our kind of sphere as a software developer, but also in industry as well, you can't really try and support all these different formats. So it's good to make wise choices, I think, when you're dealing with these 3D file formats. So we're also going to break up the slides, we're going to demonstrate some of the how we use some of the formats in our software. So hopefully you gain some good knowledge from that. So I mentioned some of the formats. I think most of you will be aware of CGM. Definitely, if you're in automotive and aerospace and defense, it's a well-documented format and well used. Also TIFF, if you're using raster images, and obviously SVG is now being used widely as well as a display format for graphics on the web. We'll also look at 3D files such as IGES, STEP, and also we're going to look at some of the formats perhaps used for creating 3D technical illustrations such as VRML and GLTF. So from a workflow point of view, today probably a lot of the new illustrations probably originate in 3D CAD from 3D CAD data, but we still have legacy data, 2D data that is being maintained. And so we have kind of two separate strands. We have a 2D stream and we also have a 3D stream now as well. So as we go through today, you'll see how perhaps we can use some of these formats, both importing, exporting, and finally into the 3D viewing or 2D viewing environment within an IATM. So that's what we really describe as the workflow of illustrations. They're going to probably be stored somewhere in a data management system. If it's S1000D, would be like CSDB, and then we'd go downstream to our IATM or IATP. So 2D to begin with. I found recently with a customer that not everybody still understands about vector and raster. So hopefully we can explain a bit more about that and the differences between the two. So let's just move into the first slide. So raster file formats. You're usually going to find that they're TIFF and JPEG within the technical illustration arena. And if it's a raster, then it's really made up of pixels. So you can see in the top right that these are going to be small squares. The size will depend on the resolution of the scan or the image, but basically not as easy to work with as a vector. So, but we still need to think about how we're going to work with these within technical illustration because of the fact that there's a lot of illustrations that have been created throughout the years that are still need to be used and maintained because the cost to redraw them or recreate them would be too high. So raster graphics are still used really a lot for display purposes as well. So, but this is usually dictated by the graphics viewer that you're using. But certainly within the automotive industry, a lot of spare parts, online spare parts catalogs still rely on raster images with an overlay for the hotspotting for interactivity. So it's good not to dismiss these formats as for technical illustration because they're still there and they will still be around for some time. With the vector file formats, as I mentioned earlier, they're kind of well established, and certainly CGM has been around for quite a few years. And I'd also describe these as hybrid formats as well. So they can contain vectors, but they also can contain raster images as well, and keep them both editable in an editable form, which is really important if you want to add to an existing raster file with a new part or whatever. You would add that with a vector drawing tool. So CGM, Computer Graphics Metafile, it's a 2D graphics format. It has a long history, and it's certainly well documented, and certainly in the S1000D specification and the iSpec 2200 spec. So it's got a profile, it can be validated, it's well used. SVG is, although it's been around a while, it's probably still really only being used for display purposes, but it's been adopted by quite a few companies now because of the ease of putting it into a web browser and displaying it in that environment. So we've really embraced the SVG format, and we'll talk a bit more as we go along about the work we've done around SVG. The other format, which we won't focus too much today, is PDF, although it's probably the most widely used of all of these formats. It's not really, in our opinion anyway, suitable for just a graphic inside a web browser or an IETM, like an embedded illustration. So, adding hotspots and things like interactivity, you can add hotspots in, but how do you link those to XML and so forth? So the CGM and SVG have a lot in common. I just mentioned that they're hybrid, so they can both contain raster and vector information. So they're both accredited by the W3C, so they're not proprietary, they're open formats. And they really are suitable for the creation and maintenance of technical illustrations. They, as I said, they both contain vector and raster. They both have the potential to be validated. There are some tools out there where you can validate a CGM file against a defined profile. And I see the same thing coming with SVG as well. And we'll speak about SVG in more detail in a minute. Both formats can contain metadata, which is really important if you want to have interactive graphics like hotspots. Say you're doing a spare parts illustration that's going into a manual where you want to link to the parts list. You could do that with both SVG and CGM. And the final one is really displaying that within a web browser. So with SVG, it's native to HTML5, which is really useful. With CGM, that became a bit of an issue because most of the viewers were based on plugin technology, ActiveX. But as Don mentioned at the beginning, we developed the Visit View HTML5 technology where a plugin is not required. The benefits of SVG. Well, I think that one of the main ones is that it's XML. So as I said earlier, perhaps it could be validated against a schema. And that could come if SVG is adopted by the S1000E, for instance, that perhaps a schema is created to validate the SVG profile. The only thing that I would say at this point still is that it's not really designed as a data exchange format. So perhaps where SVG is actually being generated, perhaps Adobe Illustrator will not take into account things that need for interoperability. So reopening a file and then working on it again. So what we're hoping is that in the future, that a profile will help actually make files more interoperable for SVG. So what we actually did to kind of circumvent that was to create our own profile for SVG called Tech SVG. So this makes the whole use of SVG within our environment anyway a lot easier and interoperable. So this is something we did because we recognized pretty quickly that creating a hotspot, for instance, within an SVG file could be done in many different ways, and none of them perhaps standard. So we created our own standard to do that. So it really helped our kind of customers work with SVG a lot easier. And that goes through different products that we actually support. So creation, viewing, and conversion. Yeah, we found a lot of files generated by Adobe Illustrator, and we worked a lot with those and with our customers to make sure that they work with our software. As I mentioned earlier, the CGM file format is well documented in the S1000 specification, but I have some good news if you weren't aware that the S1000D Graphics and Multimedia Working Group, we're tasked to document the use of SVG and a specific profile. The good news is it is complete, the work is complete and approved, and SVG will go into issue 6 of the S1000 specification. So for people waiting for that, industry waiting for that, that's really good news. Hopefully not too long away, and we'll have an official spec for SVG. And it will really provide the opportunity for users and vendors to provide a standard way of writing SVG files. So I'm going to do a short demo just to break the slides up and talk about some of the formats we just explained there. So let me just open. So this is VisX Edit. This is our illustration program. The image I have up here is a raster, so it's a TIFF file. So this is probably the most common format for technical illustrations. And I'm just going to zoom in. So if you remember from my earlier slide that we have pixels, so this is made up of just really black and white squares, which is not that easy to work with, but we still might need to maintain that in some way to add or take away from this illustration. So if I double click on it, I can now say I want to edit this. In my case here, I've just got the Paint program standard with Windows. You could link Photoshop or Corel Paint to it, anything that you're comfortable with. And then the image comes up in the raster editor. So what I could do at this point is say I just want to, to do that. I'm going to select an area and just delete it. And I'm going to save that. And let's close that down. Oops. So we should be able to see that, let me just zoom out, that it actually removed that. Can't remember where it was now. Oh, yeah, up here. So we removed that number. So now we've added, taken away the image from the image, but I've now got a library of items that I could add. So these are all vectors. So now we could see, when we zoom back in again, we can see that we have the vector image and the raster image side by side. So you can see the difference in quality, but it's a lot easier for me adding vectors to this than it is to try and add pixel lines, whatever. So then we have this hybrid file. So I could save this out as a CGM and then come back, and all the data is preserved. So the vectors are preserved and and obviously the raster. So that's the beauty of using is using like CGM as my format, or SVG for that matter. So let me just I'm just going to save this as a CGM file. I'm going to put that on my desktop and we'll just save that. So we'll come back to that in a second. The next file I have up here is a pure vector file. So this one has got hotspots on it, which we've added. If I just use my tool up here, I can see where the hotspots are on this particular illustration. So this will be used really in interactive illustration, say within a spare parts catalog. And I'll show you how we might use that in a second. But what we can also do here is we can modify. So say part 2, which is here, I could give this a tooltip. So it's already got the hotspot, but I could just give it a name perhaps as the tooltip. Let's say OK. And now we've added that metadata to this particular file. So what I'm going to do with this one is save as, this time as an SVG file. We'll save as SVG, and we'll put that on the desktop as well. So I might just give it a new name so I can find it. So this should go out, and it will contain all the hotspot information within the SVG file. So although I'm working in VisX Edit here, I could save this as a CGM or as an SVG, and all the hotspot information will be preserved. So let's just save. Okay, so now I'm going to say, how do we use these files once we've created them within a browser environment. So let's just go back, this time to the Chrome web browser. So we have a page here. I did mention VisXView HTML5, which is our CGM viewer. So you remember the illustration that I've just shown there. Here we've linked it to the text. So when we move over, the hotspot now reacts to the text. So we have an interaction between the hotspot and the parts list. So, and this could be the other direction as well. So I click on the grommet and it actually highlights on this side. So this could also be containing vector and raster data as well. So I could actually hotspot a hybrid file and get the same result. This particular file, we also have a companion file for this one. So this was generated again from VisXedit, but this time with a companion file which has translations in it. So a companion file would be an extra file in XML format, again in the S1000D spec, which would contain metadata such as a translation. So in this case, we go to German, and now we go over to the illustration, and it's updated the illustration to have German in it. So this is the one of the benefits of CGM, is that you can have this companion file. So let's move on to SVG. Let's see if I can open that SVG file. So this is a new technology we've developed for SVG. So it's called VisXView SVG. You might wonder why we've created this, because SVG is native to HTML5. But the reason we did it, it gives you a toolkit really to add, toolbars in and so forth to really interact with the SVG out of the box. So if I go to my desktop, hopefully that file that I created is here, and I can open that up. And then I go over here, and then you see the hotspots again. So everything that I created is kind of working in here. So you have the option to use CGM or SVG to display it in a web environment. Okay, so the final SVG one we have is we did some work on the bike example from the S1000D committee and of the organization. So here we link this to a parts list. So you can see it is an SVG, it's not CGM, and the parts will work in both directions. So this is just an example of what can be achieved with SVG, really just the same as CGM. You can link it to the XML and you have interactivity between the parts lists. And we can zoom. So this is we can zoom in on an area, we can pan and so forth. So we really created this viewer as this viewing technology as a kind of a starting point for people who wanted to introduce an SVG viewer into perhaps their IETM. Okay, let's go back to the slides. So hopefully I've covered all the formats there we just spoke about, which is the 2D formats. The 3D is a different ball game. As I mentioned earlier, there's kind of a multitude of different formats available. And so we have some use cases for 3D data. The first one would be you import the source 3D data from your CAD system and convert it to 2D illustration. And that would be as a CGM or as an SVG again. And that's still common. So not everybody wants to use the 3D data as an illustration. They want it to still be 2D for various reasons. The second one would be to create a 3D technical illustration and add value to that, perhaps annotations and animations. But this would be a 3D file, so we could spin it around and so forth. And the final scenario was, once we've created that, we'd need to display it as we displayed the CGM and SVG files. So we need it to be available in a web browser, perhaps in an IETM, Interactive Electronic Technical Manual. So what are the 3D data types that we could work with? Again, we want to really work with open formats, not native ones. So open formats, not owned, not proprietary. Because open really is always the safest choice, and most of the industry specifications are based on open formats. So what are the exchange formats? How am I going to get my files from my CAD system? So we would probably recommend you look at STEP and IGES. Our current customers are mainly using STEP files. At one time it might have been IGES, but today STEP is probably the easiest file format to get from your CAD department or CAD source. They're both data rich. They give you really good results if you're going to convert the 3D data to 2D. And I think probably all major CAD systems support these formats. So getting the data is usually quite straightforward. You could actually get native formats, but that will be dependency then on your, if you're going to repurpose them in some way, then have you got the right, the kind of your illustration software actually handle that file format? If it's native, it's probably not as common, so you might not handle it. So converting and repurposing of that 3D data. So why would we need another solution over and above the CAD system, perhaps? And there are specific requirements still for technical illustrations not considered by CAD systems. And probably ease of use is probably one of the main ones, to be honest. So the illustrator or technical writer will definitely benefit from software that has got specific functionality, has got good data exchange options, easy to manipulate the 3D model. So you just have really the tools that you're going to need to isolate assemblies and explode them. And also add value with perhaps animations and annotations, something more common you would find in an explanatory technical illustration rather than a CAD system. So how would I convert that 3D data to 2D? So let's have a look at our first example. So this is VisX Edit 3D. So this is our 3D technical illustration software, for want of a better word. So I've imported this step file already, and we can see that we can see from on the left hand side the model tree. So we can highlight things on here, we can move this around. Have I highlighted the turbo? We could isolate this off, and we can work with this particular file independently. So I can move this around, I can get it in an isometric view. Get it to the view that I want, and then I can work with this. So if I'm going to bring a step file into here, then I import it. We can see here that I've got IGES and step available. I'm going to choose step, and I can just bring in this file. So we have a tab system here, so I can have two CAD files really open simultaneously, and actually can copy and paste between the two. So on here now, if I want to explode this, which we've tried to make this really as easy as possible for the end user. So I've got an explosion function here, so manually now I can click on a part and I can pull this away from the model. And then I could perhaps do the bolts, and we just added kind of standard things in like shift, so I can select more than one at a time and pull that away. We can even add in location lines to where these have come from, so that should make things a life a lot easier once we perhaps convert it to 2D. So how would I convert this to 2D? Export, and then the file formats we spoke about before, CGM, SVG are all here. So now I can convert this to a CGM file, put it onto my desktop, save. I've got a few settings here that I can choose. I'm just going to take the standard ones and click OK. So it's doing a hidden line removal at this point. So it takes a couple of minutes just to optimize that. And then I can open it back up into VisX Edit. I'm not going to do that at the moment, but it'll have removed. In fact, let's just see if I can open that. Be able to find it. Here we go. Oh, I left a setting on that. We've been working on a new technology where we can fill items, which we're still trialing at the moment. So that wasn't supposed to come through. Okay. So now we have a 2D illustration. We can annotate this, add hotspots and so forth. So very quickly you can get from 3D to 2D. So back to the slides. So with, as I mentioned before, with actually importing the data, we're mainly looking at STEP probably and IGES. But how do we then create a format that we could then display these files and add value to them, perhaps animate them in some way? Probably not going to use STEP or IGES to do that. So we need to select another file format. And there's probably quite a lot to choose from. When we were developing the technology, we determined pretty early on we wanted another open format to work with. So we had certain considerations when we were choosing a format. So easy implementation of a viewer within a web browser, small file sizes, the ability to add metadata, interactivity, 3D animation, linking that IDs to XML. So we looked at various formats, and these formats are still out there. So we have X3D, VRML, which is widely used to create kind of interactive spare parts catalogs. We did look at that format. We looked at 3D PDF as an alternative, but in the end, we settled on a format called GLTF. As a format that we thought was probably the best one and most future-proof one of all the formats. So, but there's a lot of others that probably people will know of and want to add to this list, but you can get bogged down in there's so many formats to look at. So a bit about GLTF and GLB. So this is our primary 3D creation and display format. And we did research quite a few different formats before settling on this one. It's an open format, and it's now an ISO standard, which is really key, I think, going forward. GLTF and GLB, they're just different. They are the same, one of the same formats, but GLB it contains everything in one file. It's a binary file, so it's much more user-friendly to actually distribute to an ITM. There's no plugin required for a web browser to view these files. It supports 3D animations, which was very important. It optimizes the size of the files, so it brings the file size down. And it's got wide industry support from Microsoft and Adobe, to name but a few. So this was one of the key reasons that we went for this format. So we have I'll demonstrate these in a second. We've already looked at VisX Edit 3D, where you can add value to that step file that we've imported. But this time we're not going to use it as a 2D file. We're going to use it as a 3D file. So downstream we would need some way to view this file as well. So we created our own technology called VisX View 3D, which is a software development kit for viewing these files on the web. So this would be something that the developer would use to put into their IETM. We did kind of look at what was available off the shelf, but there's nothing really tailored for technical illustration. So this is why we decided to create our own technology. So it's very easy to integrate. We have customers already who've integrated it into their solutions, into their ITM. For example, Raytheon have put it into their Eagle Vision software. And they have customers already beginning to use this. So 3D animations and procedures, spare parts catalogs. So what about S1000D and 3D content? So if you've not read the spec, then in issue 5 there is a chapter on 3D, providing some guidelines how you use the 3D within an S1000D publication. It's quite high level and probably are now largely outdated. So the S1000D Graphics and Multimedia Group has decided to review the chapter, so probably to update it. And the working group also is exploring the viability of adding a 3D file format to the specification, which could result in some kind of profile. But I think we're some way away from that, but at least there is a group looking at it and perhaps trying to standardize for the future on a file format for S1000D. So I'm briefly going to go back. It says Visx View 3D here, but I'm going to briefly go back to the Visx Edit 3D, which is the creation software. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to close this down, just re-import it. So let me just find our demo files here. So what I would quickly wanted to show you is that we've been quite surprised by. Oops, did I not get that? Perhaps I didn't get it. Sorry. Sorry about that. Okay. One thing that's really surprised us is the interest in animation for 3D files. So we've tried to create an easy to use tool where when I was exploding that model before, it was just explode it and then I created a 2D. But this time, if I explode this off, what I'm doing is I'm actually recording what I do. So you can see we have a timeline and I can apply that here. So, and then I can replay that. So it's that easy to begin to actually create animations in here. So again, I can pull that off and apply it. And then I've got a two-part animation. So this has quite surprised us that there's such an interest in being able to do this and then introduce these into technical manuals. And I think when now I can export this as a GLB file, then it could go into the viewing environment, and then this could be a real file in a web browser, in an IETM, in a technical manual. So I did mention Visx View 3D. So this is our evaluation page. So this is an example perhaps of the spare parts illustration. So a bit similar as before, I've got a parts list to the 2D, but when I click here, I've got tooltips and it's highlighting the table on the left. So this is a GLB. You'll see that it is 3D. I can move it around, I can zoom in. I can change the illustration as you would do with a 2D to a different sheet. Then it updates on this side. So now I've got another illustration. Again, this is GLB, and it should highlight the part on the left-hand side. So there's that two-way thing between the graphics and the text. So very similar to the 2D side, but this time with a 3D file. and the final one, I just started to explode this a second ago, but now we could add steps in. So now we have our XML on the left with our steps, and we can begin to go through the procedure with the text on the right, but we are working in 3D as opposed to 2D. You can see I can still move this around in here. So this was something, well, so we can rotate and so forth. We can fade images away. And we have like the tooltips. But the nice thing here is tooltips can be automatically generated from the model. Okay. So let's go back to the slide. So in summary, we've looked at a lot of different file formats today, a lot of information to digest. But I think now we have a 2D world, which we're all familiar with, probably with CGM, SVG, raster formats, TIFF, JPEG, and we have tools to edit those. But now we're moving into a world where we have 3D data, where we can still create those 2D files, but also now we can reuse the 3D data. So always selecting the best software for file size, the best format for file size is important. That compatibility with a web browser, because probably the majority of technical manuals now are on the web in some way. So there's some IETM software or IETP software involved. I would always recommend you think carefully about archiving files. What file formats to archive both your 3D and your 2D files in. That's quite important, obviously for interoperability, but also reuse in the future. And we're continuing to kind of move forward at Larson on adding new functionality to all our really technologies, technical illustration, conversion, and also viewing. So thank you for your attention. We do have an evaluation program, so evaluation versions of all the technology you've seen today. So if you're interested in evaluating anything, just please contact me and we'll send you the relevant details. And we are open to some questions. So please fire away if you want to any questions answered. We'll be happy to try and answer them now or later if we can't. So, Don, have you joined me?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Somebody's mentioning JT files. We've had this previously, haven't we, about JT and the support of JT files. Do you have anything? We did investigate it, didn't we, briefly? Well, not briefly. We looked at it quite a lot. But what was did you have a take on JT? There was some kind of things that some limitations of support that we didn't feel that we could do it at this time.
Yes. Yes. Well, number one, JT is not exactly an open format. It is somewhat open. In other words, the authors have published it, but it's not as easy to support as STEP. And then there is another big limitation in JT is that it was primarily meant to be more of a viewing format, and it will not necessarily contain all the geometry of parts, so you can't convert it to a 2D view, for instance. You can't go JT and make a CGM or SVG from it. So, but I guess the short answer to his question is no, we don't support it, but we're continuing to look at, critical formats. We know it is in some communities is a widely used
I'm thinking
3D assets.
Automotive especially, I think. JT.
Yes, that's what we found.
It certainly wasn't suitable to go from 3D to 2D, was it? Because of the geometry? Because like you say, it was more a visualization format than certainly didn't have the
Yes.
geometry of step and IGES. So it probably
Yeah.
depends what you want to use it for. So we could look at it again if that was a requirement, a customer requirement, because it could be that we could open it and resave it as a GLB. Is that viable, Don?
Yes, that's correct. And we did do some work. Remember, we worked with that library,
Yeah.
integrating that. We did a test with that library, and but that's when we discovered that JTs don't necessarily contain the geometry of a part, which is really important for for creating a 2D view of it.
Yeah.
So it is relatively it is doable, and we'll certainly look at it.
Yeah, we have another question here, which I was kind of expecting, because once I mentioned S1000E and SVG, the spec is when will we be ready to convert CGM to S1000 SVG? Well, the profile is not obviously publicly available. It will not be publicly available until the spec, the issue 6 spec is launched, which is not completely dependent on SVG. That part is finished, but obviously there's other parts of 6. It's a big spec that probably are not ready as yet. So I do not have a date for the launch of issue 6 of S1000D. What I can tell you is that our SVG is working well, and we will definitely support that profile when it is published and is official. And it should be very straightforward to actually convert your existing files over to that profile. Would you say that's correct, Don?
Yes, that is essentially correct. We can, we presently support SVG in our editor, and when we output it now from our 2D editor, it becomes what we call a tech SVG profile, but is in essence we'll be close to S1000D, so we'll be well positioned to support that.
Yeah, I think so. So the other thing is around 3D is that I think we've kind of focused on the display. Somebody's asking about why GLTF and GLB, but I think the main reason behind that was that we just found it to be have all the attributes that we needed, especially animation, because we're really surprised how many companies are interested in animating their 3D models. So pleasantly surprised. So then this format supports it. It's documented within the format. And I think that's really important as we go forward, because these are going to be, for procedural type illustrations, is going to be really quite crucial. And we already have, as I mentioned, Raytheon, who have their Eagle Vision product, who can already do this and link the 3D graphic to a procedure as you would do a 2D graphic. So that's really nice, a really nice feature of the format, but also we can do it in our software. So can VisX Edit 3D be used to support augmented reality? We did have this discussion, and certainly GLTF can support augmented reality, as I understand it. So we've not done any kind of prototypes or kind of use cases for this yet, proof of concept. But I'm assuming if the format supports it and we output the format, then you just need a vehicle to actually do that. So a mechanism to display that in that environment. So it's something we'll probably look at in the future. And so I think the format, do you know anything about that, Don? I think the format is capable of virtual or augmented reality. So we output it. So perhaps we just need to come up with some proof of concept.
Yeah, and I think some use cases would be useful too, so that we can address it directly in our product. But the technology is it's all the underlying technology supports it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we also work closely with Kronos, who manage the format, both from a technical point of view and manage it as from an ISO standard and so forth. So we hope to actually get them on a future webinar, the people who actually are looking after this format. So this question always crops up. Is there a tool available that converts raster to vector? Don.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the short answer is we don't have anything available. Now we can put raster files in a vector in a CGM or SVG format, and then embellish them then with vector annotation or something like that. Excuse me. So we take kind of a different approach to that, but we think that you can work with the two of them together without having to convert it, because it's a very difficult thing to do, to convert a raster file into a vector. There are software like Adobe Illustrator can do that. You can do a raster to vector, but what you get is a very unwieldy vector file. You get these. You may put the whole drawing into one big path or something, which is just impossible to work with. So I think it's kind of one of those things that maybe someday, maybe with Chat GPT or something, it'll become more possible. But presently, no. Answer no. And
yeah, I think the thing is, it is easy to actually do it, but the result you get is usually questionable, and what you gain from doing it. So, we've been asked this. That was the only reason I kind of laughed, is that we get this question all the time, and we always come back with the same answer: is that we don't have a tool. There are ones out there, but how successful they'll be for you and your particular files is questionable. And it's usually that it's obviously the main case for doing it would be when the raster file is not a good quality. And that's probably the most difficult thing to auto trace, is when the quality is poor. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation, is that if you've got a good quality scan, you probably wouldn't want to auto trace it anyway because it's good enough. But if it's a poor quality, you probably do want to actually auto trace it, but then it's almost, you might as well redraw it because the result will be so poor. So it really is, it's not an easy one to, wish we had a tool to do it very quickly, easily, and great quality, but at the moment, it's, we saw the other directions to go in with our software. So yeah, and as Don said, most of our customers are doing well, having raster and vector hybrid files, and it might not be the greatest quality for some, but for most, it's good enough, and it works. So I think that's the end of the questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We did record the session, so if you have colleagues who want to watch, then we'll be sending out a link probably tomorrow to your email addresses, so you can forward that on. But thank you very much for your support today, for joining the webinar. We'll probably be doing one more before the end of the year. But thanks for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed it, and have a great week. Thank you.